Hello and welcome. In this video, we're diving into an important topic, the relationship between economic growth and income inequality in Kyrgyzstan. We'll explore real GDP growth, examine income inequality through the Gini index, review regression results, and analyze how all of these things interact using clear data and visuals along the way. Let's get started. To begin, let's talk about economic growth in Kyrgyzstan. Since independence in 1991, Kyrgyzstan has transitioned from a centrally planned to a market-based economy. Its growth, however, has been a little inconsistent. There's been many key drivers of its growth, which include agriculture, gold mining, and most significantly, remittances, which make up over 30% of GDP. Now, let's take a look at the real GDP growth rate chart. As you can see, growth has been volatile. There are sharp dips during global shocks like the 2008 financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, but there are also rebounds. For instance, in 2021, following post-pandemic recovery efforts, this kind of volatility reveals just how vulnerable Kyrgyzstan is to external influences, especially global commodity prices and remittance flows from abroad. So here's what we could take away from this chart. GDP growth in the early 2000s was relatively steady, around 4 to 6%, but with some sharp dips in 2005 and 10, mainly due to political unrest. 2009 reflects the impact of the global financial crisis, then we see strong rebound in 2011 and 13. In 2020, GDP contracted sharply due to COVID-19, down by about 8.6%, but in 2021 and 2022, we see a recovery. 3.6% and 7% growth, respectively. Now, let's look at the Gini index, shown here alongside the GDP line. The Gini index ranges from 0.27 to 0.3 over this period, which suggests moderate inequality by international standards. But note that inequality didn't drop significantly during years of strong growth. In fact, it remains relatively flat, even when GDP was rising. This tells us something important. Economic growth hasn't translated into greater equality. In other words, while the economy was expanding in some years, the benefits were not evenly distributed. Rural populations and southern regions like Ash, Bakhten, and Jalabad continue to face higher poverty, lower wages, and fewer opportunities, especially compared to the urban centers like Bishkek. So, even in the context of national level growth, inequality persists beneath the surface. And that's something we'll explore further as we move on to our analysis. Now, let's turn to income inequality. One of the most widely used indicators is the Gini index. It ranges from 0, perfect equality, to 1, which indicates maximum inequality. Here's the Gini index chart for Kyrgyzstan. Over the years, Kyrgyzstan's Gini coefficient has fluctuated between 0.27 and 0.30, suggesting moderate inequality by global standards. But let's dig deeper. This average hides important disparities. Like we spoke about before, rural areas, especially in southern regions like Ash and Batken, face higher poverty and lower access to public services, whereas urban areas, particularly Bishkek, benefit from more jobs and better infrastructure and higher incomes. So while inequality on paper appears moderate, the regional and structural inequality is far more severe than it appears. And if we look to our right, we can bring some statistical analysis into this. We ran regression to test the relationship between real GDP growth and the Gini index. Here's the regression results chart. What this shows is a negative relationship between inequality and growth. As income inequality rises, GDP growth tends to fall. This supports what many economists argue. Inequality limits access to education and capital. It suppresses consumer demand, and it can increase political and social instability, all of which hurt long-term growth. Of course, correlation isn't causation, but this trend is very clear. If we look at the numerical values in our regression results, we can see that the estimated slope coefficient is negative 0.0264, suggesting that 1 percentage point increase in real GDP growth is associated with 0.0264 percentage decrease in Gini index growth, holding other factors constant. Although this coefficient indicates a slight negative relationship, implying that economic growth may be linked to marginal reductions in income inequality, the result is not statistically significant. This high p-value means that we cannot reject the null hypothesis that GDP growth has no effect on Gini index changes. Furthermore, the R-square valued is 0.0000, indicating that the model explains virtually none of the variation in the Gini index growth. These findings suggest that other factors beyond GDP growth are likely the primary drivers of change in income inequality in Kyrgyzstan, like we spoke about. So, what does all this mean when you analyze the relationship between growth and inequality? Let's break it down. First, Kyrgyzstan's growth is not just unstable, it's uneven. Certain sectors and regions benefit while others fall further behind. Second, our regression suggests that inequality actively holds back growth. When large segments of the population can't access good education, healthcare, or jobs, the entire economy loses potential. Third, remittances provide short-term relief but can distort long-term development for the country. They reduce poverty temporarily, but often mask the underlying job opportunities, especially in rural areas. And fourth, Kyrgyzstan still faces major gaps in infrastructure and public investment. Education and healthcare spending, particularly outside urban centers, remains low. Without this foundation, inclusive growth is just hard to achieve. So, to wrap everything up, what we've seen today is that economic growth and income inequality in Kyrgyzstan are closely linked, and not always in the ways that you might expect. Yes, Kyrgyzstan had the moments of strong economic growth, especially in years driven by gold exports or remittances, but that growth has often been unstable and, more importantly, uneven. While GDP numbers can look good on the surface, the deeper picture shows that many people, especially in rural and southern regions, are still being left behind. We saw from the Gini index that income inequality hasn't really improved in any meaningful way. Even during the years when the economy was growing, that tells us something critical. Growth alone isn't enough. It matters who benefits from that growth. Our regression analysts backed this up. It showed a negative relationship between inequality and growth. In other words, when income inequality rises, real GDP growth tends to slow. And that makes sense. Because when too many people are excluded from opportunity, when they don't have access to quality education, jobs, infrastructure, or basic services, the economy can't reach its full potential. Inequality doesn't just hurt individuals, it hurts everyone in the entire country. It stifles innovation, weakens demand, and increases social divisions. It's like trying to run a race with half of your team sitting on the sideline. So, what can be done? Well, there's no single solution, but there are a few clear priorities. And Kyrgyzstan, I believe, needs to invest more in rural areas, support small businesses and entrepreneurs, make public services more inclusive and better targeted so that help actually reaches the people who need it, and improve systems for collecting and using data so that policy decisions are based on real local conditions and problems. Because in the end, the goal isn't just growth, it's inclusive growth. Growth that lifts everyone, not just the lucky few. Growth that reduces inequality instead of reinforcing it. And if Kyrgyzstan can find a balance between expanding the economy and spreading opportunity, then it will be a much stronger, more sustainable path forward. Thanks so much for listening and watching. If you found this video useful or thought-provoking, please feel free to leave a comment, share your thoughts, or let me know. And thank you for listening.